She wore a red dress to a date that was never what it seemed. The man across the table didn't want her heart, he wanted her secrets. And the man back at the office, the one she told herself she didn't love, he was already watching. What happens when the safest choice turns out to be the most dangerous trap? And the most dangerous man turns out to be your only way home. Here on this channel, we bring you stories of power, obsession, sacrifice, and the kind of love that changes everything. Mafia bosses, family bonds, and the moments that define who we truly are. This story reminds us that real strength isn't about running from danger. It's about choosing who you trust with your heart, even when it terrifies you. If this story moves you, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what you felt, share it with someone who loves a good love story, and subscribe because we have so many more stories waiting for you.
For 8 months, 243 days, and 5,832 hours, there was only silence. Dominic Castellano marked every single second since his 5-year-old son had fallen mute. The boy who used to shout "Daddy" each morning, who would burst into giggles when thrown into the air, who filled the kitchen with his silly, joyful songs, was now just a hollow shell with eyes as vacant as deep wells. Dominic had brought in 23 of the world's top experts. He blew through over $4 million on every treatment from Switzerland to Japan. He had made threats, pleaded, and used every bit of power a man who controlled Chicago's criminal network could. But every night, as he saw his son gripping a tattered teddy bear and arranging toy cars in silent, perfect lines, he knew he was failing in the one fight that mattered. So, on a night the city's underworld would forever remember as the fall of the Iron Fist, Dominic Castellano faced allies, rivals, and would-be assassins to make an offer that rocked his empire. "I am offering half of everything I own and my hand in marriage to anyone, man or woman, rich or poor, who can make my son speak again." Murmurs and disbelieving looks filled the room. Dominic noticed none of it. His thoughts were only on Isabella's face, the wife whose death 8 months prior had stolen their child's voice. He couldn't know that the answer to his desperate plea wasn't with a doctor or a specialist. It was with a 27-year-old woman, scrubbing the floors of his own home. A woman with scars on her back from the brutal reminders of loan sharks, with not a single cent to her name and a pain in her heart that ran deeper than his own. The pain of a mother who held her dying daughter, unable to pay for the care that would have saved her. As Dominic made his stunning declaration, 20 miles south in the bleak streets of Chicago's South Side, Eleanor Morgan counted her tips a third time. $47.63. Her fingers, chafed from washing plates for 9 hours, shook as she straightened the wrinkled cash on the diner's grimy counter. The fluorescent bulbs above her flickered, painting shadows on her gaunt face. She was 27, but the woman in the smudged reflection looked closer to 40. Rent was $400, due in 3 days. She had 47. Ellie shoved the bills into the pocket of her frayed jacket and stepped out the back door into the alley. The March air sliced through her threadbare coat. She pulled her collar tight and began to walk. Her sneakers, held together by duct tape and hope, splashed through grimy, melted snow. She smelled the cigarette smoke and cheap cologne before she saw them. 2 figures emerged from behind a dumpster, cutting off her escape. The streetlight was broken, leaving only the dim orange tips of their cigarettes in the darkness. "Eleanor Morgan," the larger man rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Tony Marcello sends a message." Ellie's heart stopped. "I told him I just need more time," she whispered, inching backward. "I'm working 3 jobs. I can get the money." The first blow landed in her stomach, making her gasp for air. The second split her lip, and her mouth filled with the metallic tang of her own blood. $50,000, the smaller man hissed, grabbing a fistful of her hair and snapping her head back. 2 months, or we find other ways to get our payment." He shoved her hard against the brick wall. Her head connected with a crack, and her vision burst into light. Your husband got in deep with the wrong crowd, sweetheart, and now you are going to settle his tab. They left her discarded in the alley like trash, blood from her lips staining the dirty snow. For what felt like an eternity, Ellie just lay there, staring at the sliver of night sky between the buildings. No stars tonight. There were never stars on the south side. Slowly, she painfully pulled herself up and limped the last 6 blocks home. The apartment building should have been demolished long ago. The elevator was broken before she ever moved in. The stairs creaked as she climbed to the 4th floor, her hands in a desperate grip on the railing. Her apartment was one room with a hot plate, a mattress on the floor, and a window that wouldn't shut all the way. The radiator hissed but offered no warmth. Yet one thing made it a home. On a makeshift nightstand made from an old crate sat a cheap plastic frame. Inside was a picture of a little girl with golden hair and eyes as blue as a summer sky, offering a sweet, toothy smile. Next to it was a small bracelet of a procedure the insurance company refused to approve. Ellie could still feel her daughter in her arms in the emergency room, the monitors screaming a flat line, her own voice begging for a miracle that never arrived. Then Marcus, her husband, who had promised to be their protector, vanished that same night. He left behind a staggering amount of gambling debt and the loan sharks who were already circling. That was 2 years ago. Ellie felt like a part of her had been dying ever since. Her phone vibrated. She nearly let it go, but a strange impulse made her check. It was an alert from a job app she'd signed up for in a moment of pure desperation. Housekeeper wanted for a Gold Coast mansion. Excellent pay, total discretion mandatory. Start immediately. The Gold Coast. In Chicago, that name meant everything. Generational wealth, raw power, and deep shadows that could make a person disappear. Ellie looked at the phone, then at the bruises blooming on her skin, and finally at the photo of Lily. "It is either die slowly or die quickly," she whispered to the picture. "At least this way I will have a full meal, right, my love?" She tapped the apply button. 3 days after Dominic Castellano's statement rocked the city's underworld, Ellie found herself standing at the massive iron gates of the Castellano estate, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never witnessed such opulence. The property stretched over what seemed to be an entire city block, enclosed by high walls where security cameras blinked like unblinking eyes. Past the gates, a cobblestone path snaked through perfect gardens, dotted with marble statues that stood like ancient guards. The residence itself was 3 stories of white stone and shining glass, looking more like a palace than a house. Ellie clutched her frayed handbag, suddenly feeling the holes in her coat and the worn-out soles of her shoes. The bruise on her cheek was now a sickly yellow, hidden under a layer of cheap makeup that was cracking from the cold air. A security guard with a stone-like face walked toward her. "My name is Eleanor Morgan. I have an interview for the housekeeping job." He glanced at a tablet and then nodded to a female guard in a nearby booth. The woman searched Ellie with cold professionalism, inspecting her purse, her pockets, and sweeping a metal detector over her body. Ellie stood motionless, forcing down her own humiliation. The male guard spoke when they were done. "This way." The journey to the front entrance felt like miles. To stay composed, Ellie counted every step. 117 from the gate to the door. The inside of the mansion stole her breath. Polished marble floors shone like dark water. A chandelier as big as a compact car hung overhead, its crystals throwing tiny rainbows onto the walls. A grand staircase swept upward, with a handrail of dark, gleaming wood. Yet, something felt off. The splendor was chilly and impersonal, like a grand museum that nobody ever visited. There were no family pictures, no small comforts, nothing to suggest that people actually lived, laughed, or loved here. The guard led her to a sitting room where a woman was waiting. She appeared to be in her 60s, with gray hair in a tight bun and eyes that looked sharp enough to cut. Her black dress was like a nun's habit, and she sat with a posture so rigid it would make a drill sergeant proud. "Have a seat," the woman instructed. Ellie sat. My name is Margaret Crawford. You will address me as Mrs. Crawford. I am in charge of all housekeeping, and if you are selected, you will report only to me. She looked at a file. Eleanor Morgan, 27. Your work history shows waitressing, cleaning services, and some factory jobs. No police record, no family. Ellie winced internally at that last part, but kept her expression blank. Why do you seek this position? I need work, Ellie replied simply. Mrs. Crawford's gaze sharpened. Everyone needs work. Why this specific job? You must know the rumors about this place. I hear many things, Ellie said with caution. I have learned it is best not to pay attention to gossip. A flicker of something crossed Mrs. Crawford's face. It might have been approval, or maybe just a lack of disdain. Very well. The rules. First, you are to have zero interaction with the young master. Absolutely none. You will not address him, make eye contact, or even acknowledge he is there. Is that clear? Ellie nodded. Second, you will never ask about Mr. Castellano's affairs. You will observe things and hear things. You will erase them from your memory. Another nod. Third, whatever occurs within these walls stays within these walls. You will not speak of it to anyone. Violate this, and there will be serious consequences. Mrs. Crawford leaned in. In this house, Miss Morgan, do you grasp the meaning of serious? Ellie held her stare. I do. Mrs. Crawford observed her for another second before standing. Come with me. The tour lasted nearly an hour. 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library, a grand ballroom, a wine cellar, and a gym. Each space was more impressive than the last, but all of them were equally devoid of life. On the second floor, Mrs. Crawford walked faster as they neared a closed door at the end of the hall, but it was not completely shut. A gap of about 2 inches let a sliver of light shine through. And in that small space, Ellie saw him. A little boy was sitting on the window ledge, perfectly still, holding a scruffy teddy bear. He was looking down at the garden, but his gaze was vacant. His eyes were empty, hollow, like windows in a house where the power had been cut. Ellie knew that look. She had seen it on another face, in another life. During those last days, when Lily was too frail to smile or cry, when only the faint glow of her life remained, Ellie's own chest tightened so hard that she could not draw a breath. Miss Morgan. Mrs. Crawford's stern voice pulled her back to the present. Ellie saw that she had stopped moving, her hand pressed to her chest. Coming, she managed to whisper. She made herself walk, made herself breathe. But the image of that small boy was now burned into her mind. She had promised herself, kneeling at Lily's rainy graveside, that she would never let another child break her heart. The agony was too great, the emptiness too profound. She had built a fortress around her feelings, brick by painful brick. But when she looked into those vacant eyes, so much like her daughter's in the end, Ellie felt that fortress begin to crumble. Much later that night, after the great house was quiet, Dominic Castellano's black vehicle drove through the gates. He was in the back, his jaw tight and his knuckles white on the seat. The sit-down with the Moretti clan had been tense. His enemies were circling, sensing weakness. His recent announcement made him seem vulnerable, and in his life, vulnerability was a death sentence. Vincent Romano was waiting at the entrance. 437 replies to the notice, Vincent said. 90% are con artists, fortune tellers, and so-called healers. He took a breath. We also flagged 6 professional killers pretending to be specialists. They saw the boy as a way to get to you. Dominic froze. Are they handled? Handled. He went up the stairs without saying more. Lucas's room was dim, lit only by a small nightlight. The boy was in bed, his eyes wide open, looking at the ceiling. Mr. Buttons was nestled under his chin, the bear's button eyes reflecting the faint light. Dominic sat down on the bed. Hey, pal, Daddy is home. Silence. Remember how you used to make those loud, fake snores whenever I talked about my job? And your mommy would laugh so hard. His voice broke. Lucas kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Dominic reached over and touched his son's face. The skin was warm, so alive, but the child inside was gone, lost in a place his father could not reach. Lucas, son, please just look at me. The boy's gaze stayed on the ceiling, as empty as a forgotten house. The memories rushed in without warning. Isabella in their kitchen, a spot of flour on her nose, showing Lucas how to flip pancakes. Lucas singing the song he made up. Daddy is strong. Daddy is tall. Daddy will catch me if I fall. He remembered Isabella on film, laughing and so full of life. Dominic had promised to shield them from all harm, but he could not stop what was happening inside her. She collapsed in the kitchen as her son Lucas watched. A problem she was born with, the doctors explained. A ticking clock inside her. By the time Dominic got there, a sheet was over her face, and Lucas had gone completely silent. Dominic grabbed Mr. Buttons, pulling the old teddy bear to his chest. Her perfume still lingered on it. I let you down, Isabella, he whispered. I failed to save you, and now I'm losing him. Tears traced paths down his cheeks. The most feared man in Chicago was weeping in the dark, holding a child's toy. A quiet knock broke his solitude. It was Mrs. Crawford. Sir, the new housekeeper is settled. Her background check was fine. Nothing to report. Dominic wiped his eyes. Good. Make sure she knows the rules. Yes, sir. She left without another word. Dominic had no idea that 3 floors down, the ordinary new girl was on a small bed, holding a picture of a child with golden hair. He did not know that her tears were falling just like his. 2 shattered hearts grieving in the night, unaware that their lives were already starting to intertwine. After 1 week at the Castellano estate, Ellie had perfected the art of being invisible. She moved like a whisper through the rooms, always working, saying nothing, making herself as small as possible. She learned the house's daily schedule. Nicole, the nanny, took Lucas for treatment each morning at 9 o'clock. Dominic was gone before sunrise and came back well after sunset. Mrs. Crawford walked the halls like a prison guard, noticing everything. And Lucas just floated through it all, a little ghost, quiet and distant. Ellie observed him from the corners of the room, the silent way he walked, the long hours he spent staring into space, the way he held Mr. Buttons as if it were his only connection to a life he had left behind. She told herself it was none of her business. She was there for a paycheck, that was it. But looking into those vacant eyes made her own heart ache with a familiar pain. On a Tuesday afternoon, as Ellie shined the railing on the 2nd floor, she sensed it. Someone was standing right behind her. She turned around. Lucas was there, just 3 feet from her, simply watching. Her heart leaped into her throat. Seeing him this close, he seemed even more fragile. His skin was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was getting long. He hugged Mr. Buttons tightly, and his haunting, empty eyes stared at her. Ellie started to speak, unsure of what to say. Lucas. Nicole's sharp voice cut through the silence from down the hall. She marched over, grabbed Lucas's shoulder, and yanked him back. What have I told you about wandering off? Nicole scolded the boy. Then her cold eyes landed on Ellie. And you are not to interact with him. Ever. Do you understand? I understand. Ellie dropped her gaze. Yes. Nicole pulled Lucas away, but just before they turned the corner, the boy glanced back. Something in his expression made her hold her breath. A little later, Ellie was dusting in the living room and noticed it. A drawer was slightly ajar. Inside, tucked away beneath old magazines, was a photograph in a silver frame. It showed a woman with dark hair and warm eyes smiling for the camera. A chill went down Ellie's spine. Ice. She recognized that face. It was 2 years ago at the hospital, on the worst night of her life. Lily's condition was deteriorating, her small heart finally failing. Ellie had cried out, begged, and pleaded for any help. Then a doctor appeared, a stunning woman with weary eyes and a gentle tone. I am so sorry, she had said, with tears on her face. The surgery he needs is something the hospital will not cover without payment. I exhausted every option. I am truly sorry. There is nothing else I can do. Ellie had despised that woman, cursing her name in the depths of her sorrow, blaming her for Lily's death along with Marcus and the hospital, and even God. Isabella Castellano. The photograph shook in her grasp. The woman who failed to save Lily was the same person whose death had left Lucas mute. "What are you doing?" Ellie jumped. Dominic was in the doorway, his expression impossible to read. His gaze shifted from her face to the picture she held. "I was cleaning," Ellie said in a rush, putting the frame down. "I saw this in the drawer. I did not mean to snoop. That was my wife." The words lingered in the room like haze. "I know," Ellie murmured before she could catch herself. Dominic's gaze sharpened. "You knew her?" "No, I meant, I noticed the resemblance to the boy." A long quiet stretched out between them. Dominic examined her face so intently she felt the urge to flee. "Do you have children?" he asked abruptly. The question struck her like a physical force. "I did," she heard her own voice say. "Once." Something in Dominic's expression changed. The frosty exterior cracked for an instant, showing a raw wound underneath. "What happened?" "She passed away." Another silence followed. It was heavier this time. Dominic looked at her in a new way. Not as a maid, not as part of the decor, but as a person. Someone who knew a grief that had no words. Ellie turned and left, her legs feeling weak. She could feel his stare on her back as she went down the hall, long after she was out of sight. She did not realize this was the first time in 8 months Dominic Castellano had seen anyone with more than just indifference. The next day, the estate was humming with a strange energy. Black sedans filled the driveway. Men and women in formal suits carried expensive briefcases inside the house. Security personnel verified IDs at each door. Ellie flattened herself against a wall as they went by, clutching her mop, unnoticed as usual. Dr. Samuel Hayes was at the head of the group. He was a tall, silver-haired man who walked with the assurance of someone who had never known failure. Following him were a child psychologist, a speech pathologist, a neurologist, and 3 assistants with equipment Ellie had never seen, the best team in the nation. She overheard Mrs. Crawford telling another worker, "Mr. Castellano had them flown in from Boston today." Lucas was taken to the library, which was now a temporary clinic. Ellie peered from the hall as Nicole led the little boy inside. He moved like someone in a dream, Mr. Buttons trailing on the carpet behind him. The doors shut. For the next 3 hours, Ellie repeatedly cleaned the same section of corridor, trying to hear what was going on. Voices rose and fell. They were calm initially, then annoyed. She could hear the sound of tools, the shuffling of documents, and the strained cheerfulness of adults attempting to get a reaction from a child who had nothing to offer. At last, the doors swung open. Dr. Hayes came out first, his confidence clearly rattled. The other experts came after, sharing looks that conveyed their failure. Lucas was the last to exit, his expression blank, his eyes vacant, as if nothing had taken place, as if nothing ever could. Dominic came out of his office, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Well?" he asked. Dr. Hayes coughed. "Mr. Castellano, I want to confirm we used every method we know. Cognitive behavioral therapy, play-based approaches, sensory work. The results." Dominic interrupted him. "I want results." The doctor paused. "Medically, there is nothing abnormal with your son. His vocal cords are fine. His brain imaging shows nothing unusual. This is purely psychological." He stopped. "Lucas has constructed a barrier around himself, a fortress, and I regret that none of our techniques can breach it." The silence that came next was unbearable. "Leave," Dominic said softly. "Mr. Castellano, if you could just—" I said, "Get out!" His voice resounded in the marble foyer. "All of you now." The specialists hurried to collect their belongings and leave. Vincent came to Dominic's side, his face lined with worry. "Boss, you have to stay calm. The Moretti family is watching. If they see you this way—" I do not care about the Morettis. The main door opened once more, and a woman entered. She was around 65, wearing black silk, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and diamonds sparkling at her neck. Her face was elegant and severe, as if chiseled from the same marble as her son's. Catherine Castellano. Dominic. Her voice was cold enough to extinguish flames. We have to talk. Not right now, Mother. Yes, right now. She shot a look of contempt at the departing doctors. Another failure, it seems. How many does that make? 20? 30? Dominic's jaw clenched. This public offer of yours has made us a laughingstock, Catherine said. The other families are ridiculing us. Our rivals can sense weakness. You are undoing everything your father created. I am trying to help my son by promising half your fortune to any fraud who says they can fix him. Catherine moved in closer. You are letting your heart guide you, Dominic. Your father never had that problem. My father did not lose his wife. Dominic's voice broke. I have already lost Isabella. I will not lose Lucas as well. The mother and son faced off, neither prepared to yield. From the dim hallway, Ellie saw it all unfold. She watched Lucas being taken upstairs by Nicole, his little shoulders drooping in defeat. She saw how the experts had poked and examined him like he was a faulty appliance. She saw that no one had just sat with him, paid attention to him, or tried to meet him at his level. She recalled Lily's last days, how her daughter had been too frail to talk, but her hands could still move, making the signs Ellie had shown her. Mama, Lily had signed, her small fingers shaky. Love. Ellie's eyes stung with tears she held back. That evening, she was cleaning the second-floor corridor when she heard something. A noise from Lucas's room. It was a soft, pained sound, like someone weeping. She moved closer, her heart racing. Through a crack in the door, she could see Dominic kneeling by his son's bed. His body was shaking. His face was hidden in the bedspread. And the noises he made were not those of a powerful man. They were the sounds of a father who had lost it all. Ellie retreated without a sound, her own tears finally spilling over. The next morning, the mansion went on as if the previous day never occurred. The experts had left. The equipment was gone. Mrs. Crawford gave commands with her usual crispness, and the servants moved through their tasks like a well-oiled machine. The failed session was not mentioned. The crying that some might have heard was not discussed. Ellie polished the living room tables, attempting to concentrate on her tasks. But her thoughts kept returning to the sight of Dominic on his knees, his frame trembling with quiet grief. She knew that kind of sorrow, the type that surfaces only in the dark when you are alone. A faint noise made her look up. Lucas was standing in the doorway, as still as a statue. Mr. Buttons dangled from his hand, the bear's worn foot almost brushing the floor. Then it fell. The stuffed animal landed with a quiet thud on the marble. Lucas just looked down at it with a vacant expression. He did not try to retrieve it. He did not try to do anything. It was as though the simple effort of leaning over was more than he could manage. Ellie looked around. The corridor was deserted. Nicole was not there. She knew the rules. Do not make contact. Do not interact. Keep away or there will be repercussions. But seeing that little boy, standing over his fallen toy with such empty eyes, she could not just leave. Cautiously, she put her dustcloth down and walked toward him. She knelt in front of him, meeting his gaze, and gently picked up Mr. Buttons. Instead of returning it right away, she held the bear with one hand and lifted the other. Her fingers moved into a familiar shape, a gesture she had made countless times. Friend, she whispered, making the sign. This means friend in sign language. Lucas's gaze shifted. For the first time since her arrival, a small spark appeared in his vacant stare. He fixed his eyes on her hands with a focus that made her heart race. Ellie formed the sign again, more slowly. Lucas watched her. He cocked his head slightly, like a bird looking at something new. And for a single wonderful second, A light flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, but it had been there. She was sure of it. Lucas! Nicole's stern voice broke the spell. The nanny marched down the hall. Her face was a mask of pure fury. What do you think you are doing? Doing? She yanked Lucas's arm, pulling him clear of Ellie. You were ordered to stay away from him. He lost his grip on his bear. Ellie explained as she stood up. I was just handing it back. I saw what you did with your hands. Nicole's eyes became slits. I am not sure what you think you are doing, but Mrs. Crawford is going to hear about this. She pulled Lucas away before Ellie could protest. But the boy looked over his shoulder one last time, his eyes locking with hers. And in that gaze, Ellie saw a familiar feeling. A soul trapped and desperate for a way out. That night, in her little room in the staff quarters, Ellie sat on her bed holding a photo of Lily. Her daughter's smile was frozen at 3 years old. Golden hair, blue eyes, and a gapped-tooth grin that could brighten any day. The memories washed over her. Lily in the hospital, too weak to talk. Her small body was failing, her heart was weak, but her hands never stopped moving. Ellie had taught her sign language when she was a baby. It was their own special world. In her final days, when speaking was no longer possible, it was how they still spoke to each other. Mama, Lily had signed, her tiny fingers shaking. Love. They were the final words she ever said. Not with her mouth, but with her hands. Ellie clutched the picture to her chest as tears streamed down her cheeks. Should Mama go and help that little boy, my sweet girl? She whispered. The room was still, but deep in her heart, she was sure she felt Lily's joy. The choice became clear in that instant. She had to help Lucas. She would find a way to connect with him, to teach him the language that kept her close to Lily, even if it meant losing her job, even if it meant losing it all. Ellie did not realize that high above in the third-floor security room, a guard was watching the day's camera footage. He stopped on one image, the cleaning lady on her knees before the boss's son, making odd signs with her hands. He reached for the phone to call Vincent. Over the next few days, a quiet little game began. Ellie waited for her shift cleaning Lucas's room when Nicole was on her lunch break and the hall was deserted. She slid a little slip of paper under the boy's pillow. On it, she drew the simple sign for friend, showing how the fingers should link together. Next to it, she carefully printed the word. The next morning, when she came to fix the bed, the paper was there, but it was different. Beside her drawing, Lucas had used a crayon to sketch a small bear with button eyes. Mr. Buttons was next to the word friend. Ellie's heart swelled with happiness. He was answering her. In his own quiet way, Lucas was communicating back. She left a second note that afternoon. This time, it was the sign for water, a simple motion of 3 fingers tapping the chin. The next day, she saw Lucas's reply. He had drawn the sign perfectly, a child's sketch of a hand at a chin with drops of water falling. Their secret exchange grew. Eat, a hand moving to the mouth. Sleep, 2 palms together by a tilted head. Happy, a hand brushing up from the heart. Every day, Ellie left a new sign. Every day, Lucas drew it, sometimes adding his own pictures. A dinner plate, a bed under the stars, or a smiling sun. They did not speak. They did not see each other during this secret correspondence. But a connection was growing, a delicate thread made of paper, crayons, and hope. Ellie started to see little changes in Lucas when she saw him around the house. His shoulders didn't seem so slumped. His eyes, still distant, would sometimes show a flicker of what looked like interest, but she was not the only one who saw the change. Nicole watched Lucas with increasing distrust. The boy had begun making peculiar movements with his hands. They were small gestures that were nonsense to her, but they looked like they had a purpose. She found him once by a window, his fingers making shapes in the air as if he were practicing. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. Lucas dropped his hands at once, his face becoming a blank slate again. Nicole did not press him, but her eyes narrowed. The situation came to a head on a Thursday afternoon. Nicole realized she had left her phone in Lucas's room and went back for it. She pushed the door open without knocking. Lucas was sitting on the floor with Mr. Button sitting in front of. He faced his teddy bear, his little hands moving in a practiced motion, fingers forming and reforming the sign for friend. Nicole stopped short in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the boy, making the gesture again and again, his lips forming silent words as if recalling a vital memory. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "Who taught you to do that?" Lucas froze, his hands falling limp. The tiny spark that had been in his eyes died out, leaving only the usual vacant stare. But Nicole saw what she needed to see. An hour later, she was in Mrs. Crawford's office, talking in a hushed, urgent tone. 2 hours after that, Mrs. Crawford was calling Vincent. By that evening, Vincent stood before Dominic holding a tablet, displaying security footage from 3 days earlier. It showed a cleaning woman on her knees before the boy, making specific motions with her hands. "The new housekeeper," Vincent explained. "She's been interacting with Lucas. We aren't sure how, but Nicole says the boy's behavior has changed." Dominic reviewed the clip without a word, his expression impossible to read. "Get her for me," he said at last. The order was given at 9 o'clock that night. Ellie was getting ready for bed when a sharp knock echoed on her door. 2 guards were in the hall, their expressions unmoving and stern. "Mr. Castellano will see you now." They led her through the mansion, up a staircase she had never used, and into a wing she had never seen. The hallways became dimmer, the atmosphere grew tense. At last, they halted at a heavy oak door. A guard knocked twice and swung it inward. The room inside was illuminated by a single lamp on a vast desk. Shadows pooled in the corners like deep water. 2 other guards stood against the walls, hands folded, while behind the desk sat Dominic Castellano, his eyes glinting in the light like a predator's in the shadows. "Close the door," he commanded softly. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sounding like a vault ceiling. "We should have a talk, Miss Morgan." Ellie remained completely still, her pulse pounding in her ears. She understood this could be the final conversation she would ever have. She faced Dominic, her heart beating like a drum, as a heavy and suffocating silence filled the space between them. The guards were like statues, their gaze locked, straight ahead, their hands poised. The lone lamp threw long shadows on Dominic's face, making him seem less human and more like a figure of pure shadow. "What were you doing with my boy?" His voice was low and controlled, far more frightening than a yell. Ellie's thoughts raced. She could deny it. She could say the gestures were a silly game, just nonsense. She could beg, play dumb, and pray he would let her go. But when she met his gaze, she recognized the look hidden behind the rage. It was desperation, the very same feeling she had known while holding Lily in the hospital, praying for a miracle that did not arrive. She went with the truth. "I was showing him sign language." Dominic's face remained a mask. "Why?" "I was a sign language specialist." Ellie drew a shaky breath. "Before I started cleaning houses, I worked with kids. Children who lost their voices to trauma. I gave them another way to speak." "You lied on your resume." I left it out. I desperately needed the work. I did not believe my history was relevant. In this house, everything matters." Dominic leaned, closer, his gaze piercing hers. "Why him? What is it you want from my son?" "Nothing." Her voice was thin. "I saw him drop his teddy bear and just stare, like he lacked the will to retrieve it. I saw that hollow look in his eyes. Tears began to well up. I knew that look all too well because I saw it in my own daughter just before she passed away." Something changed in Dominic's expression. A crack appeared in his composure for just a second. "Your daughter, Lily." He spoke the name like a whisper. "She was 3 years old. She had a heart condition from birth. We didn't have the money for the operation." Ellie's voice shattered. "She passed away in my arms at the hospital." A profound silence engulfed the room. The same condition, Dominic breathed. The same as Isabella. Yes. Ellie wiped her face with unsteady hands. And there is one more thing you need to know. Your wife was working at the hospital that night. She was the doctor who fought to save Lily. The color drained from Dominic's face. She couldn't save her. Ellie went on. The hospital refused the surgery without payment. But she still tried. She went to bat for my little girl. Her voice fell. She cried when she had to tell me there was nothing else they could do. For years, I carried so much hate for her. I held her responsible for Lily's death. But I see now. It was never her fault. It was the hospital's rules. It was everything but the woman who cried over my child. Dominic's hands clenched the desk, his knuckles stark white. Isabella never said a word, he said, his voice raspy. She carried that burden. All those children she couldn't help. And she never said a word. She was a kind woman, Ellie said gently. And a part of her is still here in your son, and he is still fighting, though he may not realize it. Dominic looked at her, his eyes filled with raw grief. Every specialist we've seen says it's hopeless. They say it is in his mind, that he put up these walls. He did. But every wall has a door. Ellie moved closer, her fear gone. Lucas isn't broken, he is just stuck. The trauma has locked his voice away. But sign language can be his key. It can give him a path to show what he can't speak. How can you be sure it will work? Because I taught my daughter to sign when she got too weak to talk. In her final moments, she wasn't crying. She was smiling. She signed, "Mama loves you." Then she closed her eyes. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks. Lucas has so much he wants to say. He just needs someone to help him find a different door. Dominic was silent for a long moment. His jaw tightened as his hands gripped and released the desk's edge. Then he slowly stood, walked from behind his desk, and he lowered himself to his knees in front of her. The most feared man in Chicago's underworld was kneeling before his housekeeper, his eyes wet with tears. "Please," he whispered, "help my son." From that night on, everything was different. The next morning, Dominic gave new instructions. Ellie's days as a housekeeper were over. She was now Lucas's private communication specialist. She was given total access to the boy and a private room in the mansion's family wing. Nicole was reassigned to a different property, no reason given. Mrs. Crawford accepted the news with tight-lipped silence but said nothing. Vincent just gave a small nod, his eyes studying Ellie with a mix of suspicion and intrigue. The real storm arrived with Catherine. She appeared without warning the following afternoon, her heels echoing loudly on the marble floors. Ellie could hear the yelling from 2 rooms down. "A maid is teaching my grandson?" Catherine's voice was sharp enough to break glass. "Have you lost your senses entirely, Dominic? She is qualified. She cleans bathrooms. She also happens to have a degree in sign language and extensive experience with traumatized children." Dominic's voice was dangerously quiet. "Do you have a better idea, Mother? Because 23 specialists have failed. 23 experts with their prestigious degrees and costly methods. Not one of them got through to Lucas. She did. This is an embarrassment to our name. Our name is worthless if my son is lost to us." Dominic's voice became as hard as steel. "This conversation is finished." Catherine swept out moments later. She passed Ellie in the hall and shot her a venomous look, her quiet glare more menacing than any shout. But Ellie did not look away. She had stared down far worse than an angry matriarch. The first real lesson started later that day. Lucas was on the playroom floor, hugging his teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, to his chest. His eyes were cautious, observing Ellie with the wariness of a cornered animal. Ellie sat across from him, cross-legged on the floor. "Hello, Lucas," she said gently. "Do you remember the pictures we drew?" He did not reply, but his knuckles were not quite so white on the bear. "Today, I want to show you some new signs. Not with crayons, but with our hands. She lifted her right hand. Let's start with this one. It means water. She made the sign, tapping her chin with 3 fingers. Lucas watched her, his focus absolute. Can you try? For a long second, there was nothing. Then, Lucas slowly lifted his own small hand. His small fingers were clumsy and hesitant, but he tapped his chin. Ellie felt a surge of hope. That's it, she whispered. You did it perfectly. They worked for an hour. Water, eat, sleep, happy, sad. He picked them up instantly. His little hands moved with more certainty with every sign, and a change started in his eyes. The emptiness was still there, but a light began to flicker in them. It was a small spark, but it was there. Just outside, Dominic peered through the partially open door. He saw his son's hands making deliberate movements for the first time in 8 months. He saw a look of concentration instead of emptiness. He saw hope, an echo of the boy Lucas had once been, breaking through the quiet. Tears ran down his face, and he did not try to stop them. That evening, after Lucas was in bed, Dominic was waiting for Ellie in the library. Teach me, he said, getting straight to the point. The signs, sir. I need to learn them. I have to talk to my son. Ellie nodded, inviting him to sit at the small table with her. She started with the fundamentals, the very same signs she had shown Lucas. Water, eat, sleep. Dominic's hands were large and calloused, built for intimidation, not for subtle movements. He fumbled with the signs, his fingers feeling clumsy and awkward. It might have been funny, this powerful man struggling with what a child learned easily, but he refused to quit. Like this, Ellie said softly, reaching over to fix his hand position. Your thumb should be on your chin, not your cheek. Her hand grazed his. For a moment, they both froze. The touch was brief, but something unspoken passed between them, something neither of them was ready for. Dominic cleared his throat and tried the sign again, getting it right. Good, Ellie said, taking her hand back. They practiced for another hour in silence. A silent tension filled the space between them. Dominic finally placed his hands on the table. Do you think everyone is worth saving? He asked softly, his gaze fixed on her. Ellie looked right back at him. I think everyone is worth loving, she answered. Even men like you. The next 2 weeks brought slow, steady improvement. Lucas was learning new signs daily. His communication grew from single signs to short requests. He could ask for a drink, point to the food he wanted, or signal he was tired. He even started showing his feelings. One afternoon, in the middle of a lesson, Lucas suddenly went still. His little hands made a sign she had shown him just days before. Sad, he signed. Then he pointed at a picture of Isabella on the mantel. Are you missing your mommy? Ellie signed to him. Lucas gave a small nod, his eyes shiny with tears. It was the first time in 8 months he had acknowledged his mother at all. Ellie gently pulled him into a hug, and his small frame seemed to melt against her. The progress was slow and difficult, but it was real. Dominic watched from the doorway whenever he could. He would practice the signs alone late at night, his tough hands becoming more graceful with every try. He sometimes sat in on their lessons, right on the floor with Lucas, a father and son learning a new language side by side. Before long, his evening sessions with Ellie became more than just lessons. They would talk long after Lucas was asleep, about small things and big things, about their grief and the strange turns their lives had taken. The conversations lasted longer each night, and the distance between them quietly disappeared. Neither of them said a word about the feeling growing there. They did not have to. But then, trouble found its way back. Vincent walked into Dominic's study one morning looking serious. We have an issue, boss. Dominic glanced up from his desk. What kind of issue? Somebody has been asking around about the Morgan woman, checking on her past, her old apartment, where she worked. Vincent hesitated. Tony Marcello. The name seemed to thicken the air. The loan shark from the South Side, Dominic stated. Her late husband owed him $50,000. Marcello has been searching for her ever since she vanished. Vincent's jaw was tight. He knows she is here now. Dominic's face remained a mask, but his eyes turned to ice. The room felt 10 degrees colder. Put double the security on her. I want a man on every door, every gate. Nobody gets close to her unless I say so. Vincent nodded, but his curiosity showed. Boss, she is just a... She is mine. The words cut through the air like glass. No one harms what is mine. Wisely, Vincent left without another word. That evening, Ellie made a terrible mistake. She had left some things at her old apartment, mostly clothes she did not need, but also a spare photo of Lily she kept in a nightstand. She never meant to leave it behind, and the idea of it being in that abandoned room bothered her. She did not tell a soul where she was going. She caught a cab to the south side after the sun went down, figuring she could get in and out quickly. No one would even know she was gone. She was wrong. They were waiting for her inside. The same two men who had cornered her weeks before. They had wrecked the place. The mattress was slashed to ribbons. The walls were covered in spray-painted threats. Her few belongings were thrown everywhere. Well, look who is back, the larger man grunted, cracking his knuckles. He did not let her scream. The beating was cold, calculated, and professional. They knew just how to cause the most pain, without leaving marks that would last. 2 weeks, the smaller man hissed into her ear while she was on the floor. Pay the debt, or next time we get creative. Just before they walked out, the bigger man saw a glint on the floor, the little bracelet she must have dropped. Pink and purple beads. Lilies. He picked it up and studied it, then slipped it into his pocket with a nasty smirk. Call it a down payment. They left her there, bleeding and broken, in the middle of her ruined past. Ellie managed to crawl to where the photo of Lily had landed. It was ripped in half, splitting her daughter's smiling face. She held the pieces to her chest and finally cried. The bracelet was gone. The very last piece of Lily she had was gone. She had no idea Dominic ordered a watch on her the second Vincent gave him the news. She had no idea a camera hidden across the street recorded the entire thing. And she had no idea that miles away, in his dark office, Dominic Castellano was watching the video, his hands shaking with a rage so deep it felt like ice in his veins. The iron fist never forgave. And he never forgot. Darkness covered Chicago like a funeral shroud. Dominic was in his study, watching the footage for a third time. His jaw was so tight it ached. On the monitor, Ellie fell to the ground as the men assaulted her. He saw one of them take the little bracelet and laugh. Something inside him broke. He grabbed his phone. Vincent, get the team, now. 20 minutes later, 6 men stood before him in the cellar. These were his most loyal men, the ones who had fought for him, bled for him, the ones who never asked why. Tony Marcello, Dominic said, his voice hard and flat. He works out of a warehouse on Holstead. I want him located tonight. What are your orders? Vincent asked. Do not end him, Dominic said, his eyes glinting in the low light. But make damn sure he never forgets this night for as long as he lives. Break what you have to break. Get back what he took. And you make it crystal clear that the woman is under my protection. Vincent gave one sharp nod. It is as good as done. The team moved like ghosts. They hit Marcello's warehouse a little after midnight. 8 men were inside, playing cards and counting cash, completely unaware of the storm about to hit them. The entire takeover took 4 minutes. Dominic's men were fast, vicious, and efficient. They broke kneecaps and shattered ribs. They left Marcello crawling on the filthy concrete, his face a bloody pulp, pleading for his life. Vincent knelt in front of him and held up a small bracelet of pink and purple beads. This belongs to someone important, he said softly. You made a mistake when you took it. I did not know, Marcello choked out. I did not know she was with... Well, now you know. Vincent put the bracelet away. The debt is gone, cancelled. If you or your thugs go anywhere near her again, if you even whisper her name, we will be back. And the next time, we will not be so polite. He stood up and walked out, leaving Marcello sobbing in his own blood. The next morning, Ellie showed up at the mansion with bruises she could not completely cover. She had used makeup as best she could, but the swelling by her eye and the cut on her lip were obvious. Mrs. Crawford saw them right away, her eyes going wide with worry, but she kept her silence. Ellie walked to the playroom to get ready for Lucas's lesson, her body stiff and aching with every movement. "Miss Morgan," she turned. A guard was at the door. "Mr. Castellano would like to see you in his study." Her stomach dropped. What had she done wrong? Was he upset that she left the property without telling anyone? She trailed the guard down the long hallways, and each step felt heavier than the one before. Dominic was by the window when she came in. He turned, and his gaze moved over her face, taking in every single bruise, every mark. "Close the door," he said in a low voice. She did as he asked, her hands shaking. Dominic walked across the room until he was standing right in front of her. Without saying anything, he reached into his coat and took out a small velvet box. "Open it." Ellie's fingers trembled as she opened the lid. There, on a bed of black silk, was Lily's bracelet. The pink and purple beads were a little dirty, but they were all there. A gasp caught in her throat. "How did you—" Her voice broke. "No one is allowed to hurt you," Dominic said, his tone low and fierce. "You are mine to protect now. Anyone who lays a hand on you will have to answer to me." Tears streamed down Ellie's face. She clutched the bracelet to her chest as her body was racked with sobs she had held back for too long. Dominic just stood there, looking lost. He had commanded men, ruined his enemies, and built a criminal empire, but he had no idea how to comfort a woman who was crying. Slowly, almost awkwardly, he reached out and drew her against his chest. Ellie just fell into his embrace, weeping on his shoulder, letting go of months of sadness and terror and ache. His arms were stiff at first, but then they slowly wrapped around her. He raised a hand and patted her back, a gentle, unsure gesture, like a man holding something fragile and priceless. They stayed that way for what felt like a long time, just two damaged people holding on to each other in the quiet room. A tiny sound made them both look toward the door. Lucas was standing there, holding Mr. Buttons and looking at them with wide, curious eyes. Then, his hands began to move, slowly and carefully, making the signs Ellie had taught him. Ellie sighed. It was a question, a whole sentence, the very first one he had ever put together on his own in 8 months. Ellie gave a watery laugh and knelt to his level. "A little sad," she signed back, "but I am getting better now." Lucas looked from his father to Ellie, and his little hands moved. One more time. "Daddy, help." Dominic's breathing stopped. He dropped to his knees beside Ellie, his eyes shining with tears. "Yes," he signed, his hands fumbling but clear. "Daddy, help." After that evening, everything was different. Lucas began to communicate more than ever. He stopped waiting for Ellie to start their meetings. He would find her, tugging on her sleeve, his little hands moving with excitement as he formed the signs. He started making requests. Apple, book, outside, play. Then he began to ask questions. Why is the sky blue? He signed one day, gesturing to the window. Where do birds sleep? He asked on another, as a flock vanished from view. Every single question was a tiny miracle. Each movement was proof that the child lost in silence was clawing his way back. But then came the one question Ellie was not ready for. They were in the playroom, going over emotions. Happy, sad, angry, scared. Lucas learned each one, his little face copying the feeling as he made the sign. Then he suddenly paused, his gaze locking on Ellie with a focus that made her heart skip. "You have a child?" he signed slowly. The room seemed to tilt. Ellie's hands froze where they were. Her hands froze. For a second, she was unable to move or even process the thought. Lucas remained still, watching her patiently with brown eyes that understood far too much for a 5-year-old. Finally, Ellie gave a slow nod. Yes, she signed, her own hands now unsteady. I had a little girl. Her name was Lily. She found a photo on her phone. It was Lily at a park, her golden hair flying as she laughed on a swing. Lucas leaned closer, examining the picture with a serious expression. Lily is pretty, he signed. She was so beautiful, Ellie confirmed, as tears started to well in her eyes. And she was unwell, just like your mommy was. Her heart was not strong. Lucas looked up at her, his focus sharp. Did Lily stop talking too? Yes. Near the end, she was too weak to use her voice, but she could talk with her hands, just like you. Ellie offered a watery smile. I taught her how to sign, so even when she couldn't speak, she could still tell me she loved me. Lucas took this in silently. Then his small hands moved once more. Was Lily sad? No, my dear. Lily was happy because she always knew how much her mommy loved her. A heavy silence settled between them. Lucas's brow creased as his young mind wrestled with a powerful idea. Then, he signed the 4 words that shattered Ellie's heart. Mommy left Lucas. Mommy not love Lucas. All the air rushed out of Ellie's chest. Now she finally understood. The months of silence, the profound emptiness in his gaze. Lucas did not think his mother had passed away. He was certain she had abandoned him. No, Ellie signed with conviction, taking his little hands in hers. No, sweetheart. Your mommy did not leave you. It was not her choice to go. She was sick. Very, very sick. The illness is what took her from you. Tears that Lucas had held inside for 8 long months finally began to fall. But she went away from Lucas. And Daddy. She never wanted to go. Ellie gently pulled him into her lap, signing the words against his chest so he could feel them. Your mommy loved you more than anything else in this entire world. She wanted to stay with you. But sometimes, even when you love someone with everything you have, you cannot stay. Lucas hid his face in her shoulder, his small frame shaking with sobs. Mommy loves Lucas, he signed without looking up. More than every star in the night sky. In his office 3 floors up, Dominic was paralyzed in front of a monitor. He had been observing them through the security feed, just as he did every afternoon, amazed by his son's progress. He was not ready for this. Lucas believed Isabella had left him. For 8 months, his son had lived with the idea that his mother chose to walk away, that he wasn't important enough to keep her there. Dominic's hands trembled, and his vision clouded over. He had been so lost in his own sorrow that he never stopped to think about what Lucas was feeling. He never imagined the awful idea that was growing inside his little boy's head. My fault, he whispered into the silent room. This is all my fault. He dropped his head into his hands and cried. Later that night, when the large house was completely quiet, Dominic slipped into Lucas's bedroom. The boy was in bed with his stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons, held tightly, his eyes shut but not fully asleep. A nightlight painted soft shadows on his face. Dominic knelt down by the bed. Slowly and with great care, he started to sign. Daddy loves Lucas. The little boy's eyes fluttered open. Mommy loves Lucas. Dominic kept signing, his motions awkward but full of purpose. Mommy did not leave. Mommy is always here. He laid his hand gently on Lucas's chest, right over his heart. Lucas just looked at his father in the dim light. Then, for the first time in 8 long months, he reached up. His tiny hand rested on Dominic's cheek, feeling the wet tracks of his father's tears. That single touch communicated more than any words ever could. The weeks that followed were filled with incredible changes. Dinners were no longer silent events. Every evening, the 3 of them would sit together at the kitchen table. They avoided the huge, formal dining room, where every noise seemed to get lost, and instead stayed in the warm center of the home where Isabella had once showed Lucas how to flip pancakes. Lucas sat right between Dominic and Ellie, his hands in constant motion. He signed about everything, asking questions, sharing ideas that had been trapped inside of him for so long. Is food good? he signed to their cook, who smiled widely even though she could not understand him. Daddy looks tired, he noted one night, pointing to Dominic's drooping eyes. Ellie is pretty, he signed on another evening, which made her blush while Dominic cleared his throat. The giant mansion slowly started to feel less like a cold museum and more like a real home. And then, laughter returned. It happened one Tuesday night. Ellie was teaching. Ellie showed Lucas a new sign at the dinner table, something to do with an animal. She fumbled it, confusing the sign for horse with the one for duck, making a strange motion that looked utterly silly. Lucas just stared at her hands. His brow tightened with confusion before his lips started to twitch. A tiny sound slipped out of him, a little giggle that was almost too quiet to hear. Ellie went still. Dominic held his breath. Lucas glanced between them, saw their stunned faces, and suddenly let out a loud, real laugh. The sound brightened the kitchen like sunshine after a storm. 8 months of quiet, broken by happiness. Tears filled Ellie's eyes. Dominic's hand found hers under the table, squeezing so tight it was almost painful. No one moved, scared to break the magic of the moment. Lucas laughed until he ran out of breath, wiping his eyes and signing that Ellie was silly again and again. It was the most wonderful sound they had ever heard. Catherine came to visit the next weekend. She showed up expecting the same empty mansion, the same haunted child, the same mess her son made with his crazy announcement. Instead, she saw Lucas dashing through the hallways. He clutched Mr. Buttons and signed quickly to Ellie, who was playfully chasing him. The boy was actually laughing. Catherine stood frozen in the entry hall, seeing her grandson smile for the very first time since Isabella's passing. Grandmother. Lucas signed as he saw her, rushing to take her hand. Ellie, teach. Lucas, talk now with hands. He showed her a few signs, his face shining with pride. Catherine looked over at Ellie, her face a mask. The coldness was still there, hidden under her polished, upper-class demeanor. But another emotion flickered deep in her eyes. Perhaps, she commented slowly, you possess something the specialists were missing. It was not quite an apology. It was hardly even an acknowledgement, but coming from Catherine Castellano, it was a huge compliment. By the end of the month, Ellie had officially taken up residence in the mansion. For Lucas, Dominic told anyone who pried, she has to be here for the lessons. Nobody bought it. Her room was right next to Lucas's, with a connecting door that was always unlocked. She read him stories before bed, signing the words as she spoke. She was there for him when he woke up from nightmares. She was there when he needed a hug, and there when he just wanted someone near. She was there for Dominic too. Little things started to add up, like snowflakes forming a drift. Dominic would cover Ellie with a blanket when she dozed off while grading Lucas's artwork. Ellie would fix his tie before a big meeting, letting her fingers rest for a second too long. Their hands would touch when they both reached for the same serving dish, and neither would pull back. Vincent saw the difference in his boss. First time in 8 months I have seen him smile, he whispered to Mrs. Crawford one afternoon, as they watched Dominic chuckle at something Ellie said. Mrs. Crawford gave a small, knowing smile. It is not only because of the child. No, Vincent agreed. It is not. One evening, Lucas woke up screaming. Not a sound left his lips, but his mouth was stretched wide open. His body twisted against unseen horrors. His hands grabbed at the bedsheets, signing broken words that were nonsense. Ellie flew through the connecting door first. Dominic was right behind her, fumbling with the buttons on his shirt. They got to Lucas together, wrapping him up between them, holding him tightly as his silent terror subsided into shaky sobs. Safe, Ellie signed on his back. You are safe, Daddy. Here, Dominic signed on his chest, staying close. Lucas held on to both of them, his little arms looping around their necks, bringing them closer over his trembling frame. His breathing eventually evened out, his hold relaxed, and sleep took him again. But Ellie and Dominic stayed right where they were, still holding Lucas, their faces just inches from each other. In all the commotion, their hands had met, their fingers lacing together over Lucas's sleeping body, holding on as if letting go would shatter something important. Neither of them said a word, neither moved, and neither let go. A month after the nightmare that united them, Dominic found Ellie in the library. "Walk with me," he said softly. "There is something I have to tell you." Lucas was already sound asleep, Mr. Buttons snuggled under his chin, while the nightlight threw gentle shadows across his calm face. For the first time in weeks, he had gone to sleep easily, worn out from a day full of learning and laughter. Ellie walked with Dominic out the back doors and into the garden. The air was cool and quiet that night. High above, stars were sprinkled across the Chicago sky like jewels on dark velvet. The city's glow was visible in the distance, but here, in this quiet haven, the rest of the world felt miles away. They walked without speaking until they got to a stone bench under a large oak tree. Dominic took a seat, and after a brief pause, Ellie sat next to him. For a good while, neither said anything. Isabella adored this garden. Dominic finally spoke, his voice just a whisper. She planted a lot of these flowers herself. She used to say our world was grim enough. She wanted to come home to something beautiful. Ellie just listened, her hands resting in her lap. When I first met her, I was already lost in this life. My hands were dirty, and I had enemies everywhere. I figured I was too far gone to be saved. He paused, looking up at the sky. But she saw me as if I mattered. Like under all the roughness and power, there was still a person worth loving. "She changed you," Ellie said quietly. "She was the only good thing in my dark world." His voice was shaky. "I promised I would keep her safe. I built a whole world to protect her. I got rid of anyone who came near her. But in the end, the danger was already inside her, her own heart." He let out a bitter laugh. "I have defeated men with nothing but my hands. I have taken down entire organizations, but I was helpless to save my wife from her own body." The hurt in his voice was fresh and deep. Ellie reached over and put her hand on top of his. "I understand," she said, "more than you realize." Dominic looked at her, waiting for her to continue. "Marcus seemed so wonderful at first," she started, her voice unwavering despite the bad memories. "He made me feel like I was somebody special. I grew up feeling unwanted, moving between different foster homes. Then all of a sudden, this man appeared and told me he loved me." Her grip on his hand tightened. "The violence began after Lily was born. It was small at the start. A little push, a quick slap. He would always say he was sorry. He would always swear it would not happen again." She took a shaky breath. "And I fell for it every single time." "Why did you stay with him?" "Because I thought I had it coming." Tears rolled down her face. "Because I thought that was how love was supposed to be. Because I had no one else to turn to." Dominic's jaw tensed, and his other hand balled into a fist. "When Lily became ill, he lost everything we owned to gambling. Every single cent I had put aside for her operation was gone. And when she died, while I was in that hospital room with her, he just disappeared. He saddled me with his debts and all the pain." A heavy silence, full of their shared loss, fell between them. "You were treated so unfairly," Dominic said with intensity. "You should have had so much more from life." "You too," Ellie whispered, her eyes locked on his. "Isabella would have wanted you to find joy again. She would not want you to be trapped by this guilt." "How can you be so sure? If Lily saw me like this, it would break her heart." A small smile touched Ellie's lips through her own tears. "The people we love want us to keep going, even after they are gone." Dominic turned completely towards her. He lifted a hand to her face, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "That promise I made," he began carefully. "The one about marrying the person who helped Lucas speak. I intend to keep it, but not out of duty." Ellie's breath hitched in her throat. Not from some desperate bargain, he went on, his voice becoming a low murmur. But because his voice failed him, the confession stuck. I was not after money or a wedding, Ellie whispered. I only came for Lucas. But now, she rested against his hand. Now, I am staying for both of you. Dominic's gaze searched her face. He gently lifted her chin, bringing his face close to hers until their breaths met in the chilly night. Their lips were only a moment away. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness. A voice, small and hoarse, unused for 8 long months. Daddy. They both froze in place. It came a second time, louder now, slicing clearly through the quiet. Daddy. Dominic was moving before he could even think. Ellie was right there with him, their hearts hammering with the same rhythm. That sound. It was Lucas. They burst in through the rear entrance, their pulses racing. The home's magnificent foyer opened up before them, with marble floors reflecting the light from crystal chandeliers. And standing there, at the top of the enormous staircase, was Lucas. Mr. Buttons dangled from his small hand. Tears glittered like diamonds as they streamed down his face. His tiny chest shook with sobs, his entire body quivering. Daddy. The word was a raw, scratchy thing, like a hinge finally forced open. But it was absolutely real. It was without a doubt his son's voice. Dominic was paralyzed at the foot of the stairs. 8 months, 243 days, an eternity of silence. Every doctor and specialist had said there was nothing more to do. Yet now, in the quiet of an ordinary evening, his son was talking. Daddy, don't! Lucas clutched the railing, his small knuckles turning white from the strain. Each word was a struggle, pulled from a throat that had forgotten its purpose. Don't leave, Lucas. The words struck Dominic like a physical blow. He was bounding up the stairs before he even realized he was moving. He took them 2 at a time, nearly stumbling in his rush to get to his son, and collapsed to his knees in front of Lucas. He pulled the small boy into his arms, holding him so tightly he thought he might shatter him. Never. Dominic choked on the word as tears streamed down his face. I will never leave you. Never. Do you understand me? Lucas wrapped his arms around his father's neck, his little body shaking with sobs. But through his tears, more words started to emerge. Lucas is scared, he said, his voice blending with signs as his hands moved against his father's chest. Daddy will also leave like Mommy. Dominic leaned back, framing his son's face with his hands, making Lucas look him in the eye. Why? He asked, his voice trembling. Why would you think Daddy was going to leave? Lucas's lower lip quivered. His hands kept moving while he spoke, the 2 forms of communication woven together. Daddy is sad all the time. His voice broke as he said the words. Daddy cries at night. Maybe Daddy wants to go to Mommy. Leave Lucas all alone. The truth hit Dominic with the force of a punch. All those nights he thought he had concealed his sorrow. All those times he had crumbled behind a closed door, certain Lucas couldn't see or comprehend. His son had witnessed it all, and Lucas had mistaken his father's grief for a wish to leave, to follow Isabella into death and abandon him completely. No, Dominic said with force, the tears creating paths down his cheeks. No, my son. I was sad because I miss your mommy, because my heart aches when I think of her. But I would never, ever leave you. He signed while he spoke, his motions awkward but definite. You are everything to me, Lucas. Mommy is gone, but you're still here, and I will be with you forever. Lucas pressed his face into his father's chest, his tiny shoulders shaking. Promise? He mumbled, the sound muffled by Dominic's shirt. Promise. Dominic kissed the crown of his son's head. I swear on my life. They embraced at the top of the stairs, a father and a son, both shattered and both starting to mend. Then Lucas raised his head, and his gaze fell on Ellie, who was standing at the bottom of the staircase with her hand over her mouth, tears silently running down her cheeks. Ellie, Lucas said, his voice still hoarse but getting clearer. Ellie will stay too, right? Ellie felt her breath catch in her chest. Dominic swiveled to see her, his eyes swollen and raw. He didn't speak, but the question in his eyes was the same as his son's. They were both asking him. They were both waiting for an answer. Ellie ascended the stairs deliberately, each step feeling heavier than the one before. When she got to them, she knelt down next to Lucas and took his small hand. "You want me to stay?" she asked gently. Lucas nodded so intensely, his entire body trembled. Ellie is family. The word seemed to hang in the air, a sacred thing. Family. Uttered for the first time by lips that had been silent for 8 months. Said not because of blood, but because of choice. Because of love. Ellie's tears flowed, without restraint now. "Then I will stay," she said in a whisper. "For as long as you want me." Lucas wrapped his arms around her neck, drawing her into the hug with his father. The three of them knelt there at the top of that magnificent staircase, a tangle of arms and tears and laughter, holding on to one another. Dominic's hand found Ellie's, and their fingers wove together. In that instant, something new was created, something delicate and precious, and true. A family built not from blood, but from broken hearts that chose to heal as one. Word that Lucas was speaking spread quickly. In a matter of days, the Chicago underworld was buzzing. The Castellano heir had found his voice. The impossible had occurred. The Iron Fist's risky bet had worked. But it wasn't a specialist who had performed this miracle. It was a cleaning lady, a nobody from the South Side with only scars and a shattered heart. The tale spread like a brush fire. Catherine showed up at the mansion 3 days after that night. She discovered Lucas in the playroom, chattering away in his unique blend of speaking and signing, excitedly showing Ellie his drawings. The boy who had been like a ghost was now glowing with light. Catherine stood watching from the doorway. When Ellie finally saw her, she prepared for the usual icy reception. But instead, Catherine walked across the room and pulled her into a hug. "I misjudged you," the older woman admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "Please forgive me, and thank you." Ellie was frozen, unsure how to react. Before she could say anything, Catherine stepped back, dabbed her eyes, and addressed her grandson like nothing had happened. But a profound shift had occurred. Dr. Hayes arrived the next week, called in to assess Lucas's improvement. He spent 2 hours with the child, conducting tests, watching him interact, and scribbling notes frantically. "This is nothing short of a medical miracle," he announced later, shaking his head in sheer wonder. "I've never witnessed anything like it. The psychological recovery paired with this alternative communication. It shouldn't have been effective, but it was." He looked at Ellie with newfound admiration. "Whatever you did, Miss Morgan, you accomplished what the entire medical field could not." But Ellie knew the reality. She hadn't performed any miracle. She had just looked at a shattered child and saw a version of herself. A week later, Dominic took her to an unexpected place. The cemetery was on a hill with a view of Chicago, green and tranquil under the gray sky. They walked without speaking past rows of gravestones until they came to one that was set apart. Isabella Marie Castellano, cherished wife, loving mother, forever in our memories. Fresh flowers were at the base of the marker. White roses were still damp from the morning. "I visit every week," Dominic said softly. "Sometimes more often." Ellie knelt at the grave, her own heart aching. "You were a kind person," she whispered to the stone. "I am so sorry I ever resented you. You tried to help my daughter. You wept for her when I didn't have the means to save her." Tears slid down her face. "The whole system let us both down. Not you. It was never you." She laid her hand on the cool marble. "I will look after them now. Your husband and your son. I will love them with my entire being." Her voice failed her. "Please, rest in peace." Dominic knelt next to her, his shoulder brushing against hers. "I found her diary," he said quietly. "For months after her death, I couldn't even look at it. But just recently, he said, collecting his thoughts. She wrote of a little baby girl she was unable to save. The child had a heart defect, and her mother pleaded with her for help. She wrote that the hospital demanded payment before the surgery, that she argued for them and lost. Ellie felt her own breath catch. She wrote, I let that little girl down today. The sounds of her mother's pain will follow me forever. I cannot let Lucas down. I will not fail my own son like I failed her. Tears rolled down Ellie's cheeks without stopping. She did not fail, Ellie whispered softly. She fought. She had a heart. That is so much more than what most people do. Dominic pulled a single white rose from his pocket. He laid it carefully against the cold stone of the grave. Isabella, he said, his voice thick with feeling. I found someone. She can never replace you. No one could, but she will keep loving everything you had to leave behind. They remained there for a very long time, kneeling side by side at the grave, allowing the past to surround them and finally start to fade. On the ride back home, Dominic reached over the center console and held Ellie's hand. My public announcement is still in effect, he said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I promised I would marry whoever helped Lucas speak. Ellie's heart pounded inside her chest. But I do not want you to say yes out of a sense of duty. He glanced over at her, his eyes blazing with a fierce yet gentle light. I want you to say yes because... His words seemed to stick in his throat. He never completed the thought. But seeing the look in his eyes, Ellie knew what he meant. A week after their cemetery visit, Dominic guided Ellie to a section of the house she had not yet seen. They went down a secret staircase behind the library, moved through a tight hallway lined with old paintings, and paused at a heavy oak door bound with iron. Where are we? Ellie asked. Dominic gave no reply. He just swung the door open. The space that opened up before her was stunning. It was a huge circular room with high ceilings and walls covered in dark velvet. A long table stood in the middle, encircled by vacant chairs. This was the place where the city's hidden powers met, where deals were made and rivals were finished, where control shifted with whispers and threats. But on this night, the room was completely different. Hundreds of candles shimmered from every surface, making shadows dance upon the walls. All the chairs were moved to the side. The table was empty, except for one document lying right in the center. Dominic approached the table and lifted the paper. This is the room where I made that announcement, he stated, his voice bouncing off the high ceiling. This is where I stood in front of everyone, allies and foes, and swore to give half of my entire fortune to whoever could make my son talk again. Ellie just watched him, her heart thumping. I was a broken man that night, desperate. I would have given anything. He looked at the document he was holding. This is the real declaration. It is signed and witnessed, a legal commitment. He took a lighter out of his pocket. A small flame touched the paper's edge. The fire spread across the text, burning away a promise made from desperation and canceling a debt that came from grief. Dominic dropped the burning paper into a metal bowl where it turned into ash. I do not require this any longer, he said in a low voice. Ellie's eyes shone in the flickering light. I never wanted your fortune, she whispered, or your cash, or any of that. I am aware. Dominic pivoted to look directly at her. That is precisely why I destroyed it. He reached inside his jacket and took out a small box covered in velvet. Then, he got down on one knee. Ellie forgot how to breathe. Eleanor Morgan, Dominic began, his voice filled with emotion. I am not asking you this to keep a promise. I am not doing this because I feel obligated or grateful or in your debt. He flipped the box open. A simple diamond ring lay inside, glittering in the candlelight like a tiny star. I am doing this because, at some point between your first day here and right now, I have fallen in love with you. Tears began to fall from Ellie's eyes. You healed my son, Dominic went on. But you healed me too. You proved to me that sorrow does not have to be the end of the story, that even shattered hearts can find their rhythm again. His hands were shaking as he presented the ring. I am asking you to allow me to love you, to let me make a family with you and Lucas. Let me use the rest of my life to show you that you are worthy of all the joy in the world. He took a deep breath. Eleanor Morgan, will you be my wife? For a long moment, Ellie was speechless. The tears came down, but her smile was more brilliant than every candle there. Yes, she whispered. And then with a laugh, she said it louder. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Dominic carefully slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, like it was always meant to be there. He stood up and gathered her into his arms. They shared a kiss that was both soft and strong, loving and urgent. A kiss that made a promise no piece of paper ever could. The sound of the door opening made them pull away. Lucas was standing there. Vincent and Mrs. Crawford were right behind him. The little boy's eyes were wide with a mix of hope and worry. Ellie, he asked, his voice still a bit weak, but getting better each day. Did you say yes? Ellie laughed while crying and knelt down to his height. Yes, my dear, I did. I said yes. A huge smile spread across Lucas's face, the biggest one she had ever seen. He dashed across the floor and launched himself into their embrace, almost toppling them. Family, he yelled, his voice echoing, clear and powerful. We are a family. The three of them clung to each other in the candlelight, a mix of laughter and tears. Dominic kissed the top of Lucas's hair, his arms holding them both tightly. Thank you, Isabella, he murmured into the quiet, flickering room. Thank you for bringing her to us. 1 month after the proposal, the garden was filled with white roses. The wedding was intimate, not in a large cathedral, without hundreds of people, and with no show of underworld power or money. It was just a quiet ceremony in the garden Isabella had cherished, under the oak tree where Dominic and Ellie had first shared their deepest secrets. 30 chairs were set up in a half circle. Only close friends, trusted associates, and dedicated staff were there. Vincent was by Dominic's side, looking stiff in his formal wear. Mrs. Crawford used a handkerchief to dab her eyes, pretending it was just her allergies. Then, at the start of the White Runner, Ellie came into view. She had on a simple dress the color of ivory that moved like water with the soft wind. She wore no veil or fancy jewels, only Lily's bracelet on her arm and a wreath of white roses in her hair. She had never been more stunning. Catherine came forward as Ellie neared the front. She was holding an old tiara made of delicate silver with small diamonds. This was Dominic's grandmother's, Catherine explained, her voice firm, though her eyes were shining. It has been on the head of every Castellano bride for 4 generations. She said it carefully, on Ellie's head. Welcome to our family, she whispered. For real this time. Ellie's eyes filled with tears that she made no effort to stop. Lucas then came down the aisle, holding a small cushion with 2 rings on it. He walked with a sure step and a big smile, his eyes shining with happiness. Mr. Buttons was held under his arm, because some things were just more important than rules. When he got to the front, he looked at his father and signed a message. I did a good job. Perfect. Dominic signed in return. Absolutely perfect. The service itself was short but meaningful. Dominic held Ellie's hands, his voice heavy with feeling. I used to think my heart was buried with Isabella, he said. I thought all I would ever feel again was pain and anger. You showed me I was wrong. You brought the light back to our world. You helped my son find his voice, and you gave me a reason to believe again. Ellie held his hands tightly, tears flowing down her cheeks. I used to think I was not worthy of love. She answered, I believed I was too damaged to fix, that being happy was meant for other people, and not for a person like me. You showed me I was wrong. You taught me that old wounds can fade, that shattered hearts can heal, and that even the saddest stories can have wonderful endings. They both looked at their small group of guests. We will show everyone they are wrong. Together, they said at the same time. The rings were placed on their fingers, the promises were made, and as Dominic kissed his new wife, the garden was filled with cheering. But the sweetest moment was still to come. Lucas went up to Ellie, pulling gently on her dress. She knelt down to him, and he put his small hands on both sides of her face. "I love Daddy," he said plainly, his voice clearer than it had ever been. "And I love Mommy, Ellie." That word struck Ellie with the force of a wave. Mommy. She never thought she would hear that word said to her again. She had not even allowed herself to wish for it. "Oh, my sweet boy," she cried, pulling him close. "I love you too, so very much." Dominic put his arms around both of them, his own tears falling without shame. In Ellie's thoughts, an image appeared. It was Lily laughing on a swing, her golden hair flying, her face shining with pure happiness. In Dominic's mind, he saw Isabella smiling. She was standing right here in this garden, her hands dirty from planting her roses. Her eyes were full of love. The two memories seemed to blend, seemed to glow with a blessing, with acceptance, with peace. That evening, after everyone had left, the three of them were sitting in Lucas's room. The boy was chatting happily, using words and signs as if it were the most natural thing, showing Ellie the pictures he drew that day. Dominic reached into his pocket and took out something small. "Lai's bracelet. I had it polished," he said gently, taking Ellie's hand. "And I want you to have it always, so she can always be with you." He secured it on her wrist beside her wedding ring. Ellie completely lost her composure, hiding her face against his chest. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for all of this." They held one another while Lucas kept on chattering, unaware of the gravity of the moment. Then he suddenly went quiet. "Daddy," he said, tilting his head. "Yes, son. Can I get a baby brother?" Dominic and Ellie glanced at each other, their surprise dissolving into laughter. "We will certainly try our best, honey," Ellie replied, drying her eyes. "We will definitely give it a try." A year after the wedding, their life was completely transformed. Ellie was standing on the rooftop terrace. Her hand rested softly on her round belly. At 6 months pregnant, the baby would kick wildly whenever Lucas put his ear to her tummy. "Hey, baby, it is Lucas," the little boy would say for the 100th time that week, his lips brushing her skin. "I am going to be your big brother. I will show you how to sign, and you can play with Mr. Buttons, but not all the time." Ellie chuckled, stroking his hair. Lucas had truly bloomed into a new person. He was in a normal kindergarten now and already had 3 good friends. He chattered non-stop, using a wonderful blend of speech and signs that was uniquely his. Mr. Buttons still kept watch from his nightstand. But Lucas did not need to hold the bear tightly all night anymore. He slept soundly, knowing he was cherished and secure, and that he would never be abandoned. Dominic was a different man as well. He had withdrawn from the riskier parts of his business, handing over control to people he trusted. His rivals were still wary of him, but his focus had completely changed. His family was now his whole world, and nothing else mattered as much. The foundation was his proudest achievement. Launched 6 months prior, the Isabella and Lily Foundation was devoted to helping families who could not pay for surgery for children with heart conditions. Each operation they covered, each life they helped save, honored the 2 they had lost. It was a promise that no other mother would suffer the way Ellie had. That evening, the 3 of them were on the roof, lying on blankets and watching the first stars appear. "Hey, Mommy Ellie," Lucas said, pointing to the sky. "What is it, sweetie?" "Mommy Isabella and my sister Lily are in heaven, aren't they?" A mix of sadness and love filled Ellie's chest. "They are, honey. And they are always looking down on us, and they are happy." Lucas looked at his dad. "Because we are happy." Dominic hugged his son tightly, his voice choked with feeling. "Yes, they are very happy. Because we all found one another and made a family." Lucas thought about that for a second. He then sat upright and lifted his small hands to the night sky. "I love you all," he signed, his motions sharp and sure. Ellie began signing too, her hands mirroring his. Dominic's hands followed, a little less graceful, but just as heartfelt. 3 sets of hands, sending their love to the stars. A quiet settled over them. It was not a sad or empty silence, but a truly peaceful one. Ellie gazed at her husband, her stepson, and then down at her stomach, where a new life was stirring. She reflected on the long road that led her to this moment, through foster care, terrible abuse, a broken marriage, the loss of Lily, and so many nights she almost lost hope. It all started with a simple job ad that brought her to this house, to this man, and to a shattered little boy who put her back together, just as she did for him. She whispered softly, "Sometimes the biggest heartbreaks bring the most beautiful love." Dominic heard. He reached across a sleeping Lucas and took her hand in his. "You know, I always thought that was the worst night of my entire life," he said softly. "The night I made that crazy offer to the public, I thought that was my breaking point." He brought her hand to his lips for a soft kiss. "But it turned out to be the night that saved me. I just was not aware of it then." Lucas was now sound asleep, nestled between them. His breath was quiet and steady, his face serene under the stars. Across their son, Dominic and Ellie's eyes met. Nothing needed to be said. Their hands connected in the dim light, and they held on tight. High above, 2 stars seemed to gleam brighter than all the others, as if they were sharing a happy smile. It is true that the worst pain can lead to the deepest love. And sometimes, loss shows us how to value what we still have. And sometimes, family is not about who you are related to, but about the hearts that find their way to each other. Always remember, when you cannot find the words, love will find a way to be heard. Did this story resonate with you? We would be so happy to read what you think in the comments. Tell us how this story made you feel. Did it bring up any memories for you? We hope you will share your own experiences with us. We truly value every single comment and make sure to read them all. If you were touched by this story, we would appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribed to our channel. That way, you will not miss out on our next story. And please share this with anyone who needs a reminder that love is powerful enough to heal any wound. We send our best wishes to you and everyone you care about, for good health, true happiness, and a sense of peace every single day. We hope your days are filled with wonderful moments and strong connections. Thanks for being here with us. Take care, and we will catch you in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.